Hi, I'm Mike, a driver and driver trainer here at Jeff Foster Trucking. Today we're going to go through the important steps of doing a pre-trip inspection. The first part of a pre-trip inspection is looking at the overall condition of the truck as you approach it. The first thing I like to do is look underneath to see if there's any dripping or any puddles that have formed overnight. As I walk up to the vehicle, I also check the windshield to make sure it is not cracked or chipped. Make sure you have the up-to-date IFTA sticker. Next, I like to check the headlights. Check to make sure the lenses are not cracked, make sure they're clean and in good order. In the front, you want to check your license plate, make sure it is current. You want to check all your lights. Check your four-ways, your brights, and your fog lights. You also want to check your cab lights on the top. Next, you want to check your side marker light or lights on both sides of the tractor. If you have any work lights in the back, you want to check to make sure those work. And last, you want to check your tail, brake, reverse, and license plate light. The next thing I like to check is the nose mirror. I like to make sure it's clean, not cracked, and safely secured. Then I check the side mirror. Check to make sure that the glass is not cracked, make sure it's clean, and make sure it's secured tightly to the truck. From here, I continue down the exterior of the truck. I will check the batteries, which are underneath this panel, making sure they are safely secured to the truck. Check my steps to make sure they are secured. Check the fairings, making sure all your fairings are secured. Open the door, make sure your door is secure. Check your weather stripping, making sure your weather stripping is not ripped or cracked. Continuing on, I'll keep on checking all my fairings. Check my caps, open my def cap. Make sure the gasket is on there. Make sure the safety chain is on there. Open the fuel cap. Checking for the gasket. Checking to make sure the safety chain is on there. Making sure all the fairings are secure. Checking the overall exterior of the sleeper. Making sure there's no cracked glass on either the upper window or the middle window. I'll check for my triangles, make sure there's 3 in there, and checking my fire extinguisher, making sure it is in the green and it is safely secured to the truck. From there, I look under the hood. First thing I check under the hood is the coolant level. Make sure it's between the full and minimum lines. Then I check the hose to make sure it is not leaking. I check the clamp, make sure the hose is secured. I check the electrical connections on it. I also check all the air lines right here. Next, I check my oil. Make sure it's within the marks. I check my power steering fluid, make sure it's full. Check the hose connections, make sure there's no leaks coming out of them. Check the clamps, check the filter, make sure there's no leaks, and make sure it's firmly secured to the truck. Next, I check my steering shaft, and I check my gearbox. I check my nuts and bolts to make sure they are not cracked or bent. Make sure it's securely fastened to the frame. Next, I check the pitman arm. Check to make sure it is secured with a castle nut and the cotter pin. Then I check the drag link to make sure it's secured with a castle nut and a cotter pin. Then I check the steering arm to make sure that is secured to the steering knuckle. Next, I check the tie rod end to make sure that is also attached with a castle nut and a cotter pin. Next, I check my mounting bracket for the leaf spring. I check my shackle to make sure it's secured to the frame. Check to make sure it's not cracked, bent, or broken. Then I check the leaf spring to make sure it is not cracked, bent, or broken. I also check the forward mounting bracket for the leaf spring to make sure it is not cracked, bent, or broken, and check all my nuts and bolts to make sure they are not cracked, bent, or broken. I check the U-bolts to make sure they are not cracked, bent, or broken. I also check the shock to make sure it is not cracked, bent, or broken. Check all my nuts and bolts. I like to check all my hoses to make sure they are firmly secured. Check my clamps to make sure they are secured and tight. I like to go through my fan. Check to make sure that all my fan blades are there and not broken. Make sure the fan spins. Next, you want to check your brake cam. Make sure it is firmly secured. not cracked, bent, or broken. You want to check your air lines, make sure there's no air leaks coming out of them. You want to check your caliper, make sure it's firmly secured. You want to check your rotor, make sure there is no cracks, no debris on them. You want to check your brake pads. Your brake pads should be at least 1/4 inch of thickness. Next, you want to check the wheels and the tire. For the wheel, you want to check the inside and the outside. You want to check your wheel seals. For that, you're looking for any fluid leaking out the back or any fluid leaking out the front. You also want to check for any non-manufacturer welds on the wheel and any cracks in the wheel. You also want to check your lug nuts. For that, with the caps on them, you'll be checking for any rust marks coming out the bottom. On your tire, you want to check for any flat spots on top, any uneven wear, any bulging or any cracking in the sidewalls, both inside and outside. You also want to check your tread depth. Steer tires have to have a minimum of 4/32 of tread depth. For that, you can use a little tool called a tread depth gauge, which is this little guy right here. You also want to check for proper tire inflation. For that, you want to check the sidewall of the tire for the proper PSI, which on these is 110 PSI. For that, you can use a tire gauge to check for proper inflation. On the other side of the engine, you want to check your belts, both of them. You want to make sure they have no more than 1 inch of play in them. You also want to check all your hoses. Make sure all your hoses are connected. Check all your hose connections. Check all your clamps, both top and bottom. You also want to check your exhaust system from the turbo back. Here you're looking for any kind of blow-by or any kind of soot buildup. You also want to check all your heating hoses. Make sure there's no leaks and make sure they are also fastened and all your connections are tight. You want to check your windshield washer fluid, and then anything that you checked on that side in regards to suspension, tires, wheels, and brakes, you also want to do on this side. And just like the other side of the truck, you want to check your mirrors to make sure they're secured. You're checking all your glass to make sure it is not broken. Checking your glass on your door. Checking your door to make sure it's secured to the truck. Checking your weather stripping to make sure it's not cracked or broken. Checking your steps to make sure they're secured. And while you're walking along, you can check all your fairings to make sure they are secured to the truck. And then just checking the overall appearance on the outside of the sleeper. Checking to make sure there's no broken glass on either the top or the bottom, and making sure your door is also secured and shut. Continuing on to the back of the cab, I like to check my DOT inspection sticker. Next, I check the strap for the fuel tank to make sure it's secure. And I check the connections for the fuel tank to make sure there's no leaking. Then I check the airbag on both sides of the cab and the shock on both sides of the cab to make sure they are secured and no punctures or bulging in the airbag. You want to make sure you have DOT top, the upside down L's, up in the corner of the cab. Next, you want to check your connections in the back. Your air connections, make sure they're secured to the truck. Same thing with your electrical connection, make sure it's secured to the truck. Check your hoses. You're looking for any kind of wear and tear on the hoses, any bulging. You also want to check to make sure that the rubber grommet is not missing and that is in good shape. Make sure that your catwalk is secured to the frame. If you have steps or any other saddle box, make sure that it is also secured to the frame. You want to check all your mounting bolts for the springs to make sure it's secured to the truck, along with your mud flap to make sure that is secured to the truck. Moving on, I like to check my wheel seal. Check for any leaking coming from the rear of the seal. I like to check my brake rotor, make sure there's no debris on the brake rotor. I like to check my brake caliper. I also like to check my brakes, make sure there's a 1/4 inch of pad on the brakes. I like to check my spring, make sure it's secured, not bent or broken. I like to check my U-bolts, make sure they are not cracked, bent, or broken. I like to check my brake can, make sure it's secured, not cracked or broken. And check my air lines. Make sure there's no bulging or cuts in the lines. Moving on, I like to check my airbags on both sides. Make sure they are properly secured to the truck. Make sure there is no leaking. Make sure there is no bulging or cracks in the airbags. Next, I like to check the shocks. Make sure they are properly secured. Make sure there's no leaking out of the shocks. I like to check my torsion bar. Make sure it's properly secured. Also like to check my U-joints, make sure that there's no wear and tear on it. Moving on, I like to check the fifth wheel. You want to check the mounting plate for the fifth wheel. check all the bolts, make sure they are not cracked, bent, or broken. You want to check the mounting bracket for the fifth wheel. Make sure all the bolts are intact. Check the fifth wheel plate itself. Make sure there's no cracks. Make sure it's not broken. Check your locking arm. Make sure it operates. You also want to check your frame. Make sure there's no cracks or holes in your frame and make sure it is straight. You want to check your airbags, your shocks, your braking system, and your suspension on both axles on both sides of the truck. Next, I like to check my wheels and my tires. On the tires, you're checking for any lacerations or bulges or air leaks or uneven wear. You're also checking for tread depth. Tread depth is 2/32 on drive tires, unlike the front, which is 4/32. For that, I like to use a tread depth gauge. I also like to check my bud system. Make sure there is no gap and make sure there is no debris. Checking both the inside, the middle, and the outside of my wheel, I like to look for any cracks or any welds. I like to check all of my lug nuts, placing my hand on each one of them, checking to make sure they are tight. I will also look for rust streaks, which would indicate a loose lug nut. Also check your valve stem to make sure that it has the cap on both the inner and outer wheel. I like to run my hand around the rear wheel seal to make sure there's no oil dripping out of the rear. I like to check the pressure of my tire with a proper tire pressure gauge. And you want to check that on all 4 sets of tires. From there, I like to move to the back where I'll check my mud flaps to make sure they are secured and mounted. Make sure all the DOT tape is on both sides, both on the mud flap and on the frame. I like to check the frame itself to make sure it's straight and not bent. I like to check my cross members to make sure they are straight and in line. From here, you can also check your airbags and your differential and to make sure your drive shaft is straight. Before backing under a trailer, you want to check your trailer apron and your kingpin. You want to make sure the trailer apron is not cracked or broken or caved in, and you want to make sure your kingpin is not cracked or broken. Once you back under the trailer, you want to give the trailer a tug test. That will determine whether the trailer is attached to the truck. From there, you want to come behind, look at your fifth wheel plate, and make sure the jaws are locked around the kingpin. You also want to check to make sure your locking pin is pushed in. You also want to make sure there is no gap between your trailer apron and your fifth wheel plate. You also want to make sure that the locking pin is in. Next, you want to check your federal inspection to make sure it is up to date. Then you want to check your air connections to make sure they are not cracked or missing. And then you want to check your electrical connection to make sure it is not corroded or damaged. Plug in your electrical cord and make sure your ABS light cycles off and on. If it stays on, you have a problem. The ABS light must be marked on the back of the trailer and must be amber in color. Next, I will hook up my air lines, both my service air and my emergency air. I will air up the trailer and listen for air leaks. Next, I check the front and the side of my trailer. You want to check for the overall condition of both the front and the back, and you want to check to make sure all the rivets are intact. You also want to check your rub rail to make sure that is in good condition, along with all the DOT tape, making sure it's alternating red and white, and that you have 50% coverage on the trailer. Next, you want to check your landing gear. You want to make sure it's secured, not cracked, not broken. You want to check your landing pad. You want to make sure that is secured and not broken. You also want to check all of your cross members to make sure they are intact and secure. You also want to check your connecting rod to make sure it is intact and secured to both sides. Also, any type of fairing or attachment, you want to make sure they are secure to the trailer and in good working condition. Moving to the rear of the trailer, you want to check your airbags. You're checking for any bulging, any leaking, or any lacerations. You also want to make sure that your airbag is attached securely. You also want to check your shocks. You want to make sure they are secured and make sure they are not leaking. You also want to check your brake cams. You want to make sure your brake cams are secured and not broken. You're checking the C-clamps to make sure they are on there. You're also checking your air lines to make sure they are not kinked or bulging. You're also checking your brakes. You want to check your rotor to make sure it's free of debris, and you want to check your brake pads. Your brake pads must have a 1/4 inch of pad left on them. You also want to check your wheel seal to make sure there is no oil leaking onto the rotor or onto the rim. Next, you want to check your air lines. You want to check to make sure they are tight and not leaking air. You also want to check your air receiver tank. You want to make sure that your tank is secured to the trailer and not leaking air. Next, I check the slide rail to make sure it is free of debris and not broken. And you want to check all those items on both axles, front and rear. Next, you want to check your air lines. Make sure that your springs are attached to keep them off the ground, and check any connections you have to make sure they are secured and not leaking. You also want to check your cross members to make sure they are not cracked, bent, or broken. And just like the tractor, you want to check both the wheel and the tires, both the inside and the outside. You also want to check all your lug nuts, placing your hand on each one of them to check for tightness, while also looking for rust streaks, which would indicate a loose lug nut. On this particular wheel, this has a tire inflation system, which means it inflates from the truck. So for that, you're checking any of the air connections to make sure that there is no leaking. If they were not there, you would use your air gauge to check for the proper pressure. You also want to check your hub oil to make sure it is not leaking and that it is within the add and full marks on the sight glass. You also want to check to make sure your mud flap is firmly secured to the frame. Also, make sure the pins for your axle are pushed out to prevent the axles from sliding forward or backward. Check all 4. Next, I'll come to the back of the trailer and check my doors. I will check all my hinges to make sure they are not broken, and I will check all the bolts to make sure they are not broken. I will also check all my DOT tape to make sure it is there. I will also check the DOT tape on the bumper and up in the corners of the trailer in a backwards L. I will check all my weather stripping on the door to make sure it is not broken or missing. Make sure the door swings. I will also check the handles and the hinges to make sure the door opens and closes properly. Check your locking devices for the door to make sure it will stay secured when you open it. I will also check the license plate and the license plate light. With that, I will also check my license plate with the registration slip. From there, I will check all of my lights. You want to check your blinkers, your four-ways, and your brake lights. You also want to check the clearance lights on the top of the trailer and all the clearance lights along the side of the trailer. As you check your lights, you want to check the lights on the side of the trailer. You want to check your side marker light, which is also a blinker. Once you get into the cab, you want to check your windshield to make sure there are no cracks or chips in it. You also want to check your windshield wipers to make sure they come on and operate. Make sure windshield washer fluid comes out. You also want to check your horns, both your city horn and your air horn. You want to check your defrost to make sure your defroster works. Then you want to check all your indicators on your dashboard. Check your blinkers, both left and right. Check your four-ways. And check your brights. Next, you want to check your gauges. You want to check your volts, your oil pressure, your fuel, and your engine temp. Next, you want to do an air leak test. With the engine not running, you will place your foot over the brake, release both your tractor and your trailer brake, and once the air settles, you'll watch your air gauge. Hold your foot on the brake pedal for 1 minute. Once everything settles, you cannot have more than 4 psi in 1 minute of air loss. Next, I will fan the brakes to check the safety devices. You'll fan the brakes. An alarm should come on right around 60 psi. And your safeties should pop the brakes between 20 and 45 psi. After the air leak test, you want to do a brake test. For that, you will place your foot over the brake, release your trailer brakes, put your truck in drive, pull on it to see if your tractor brakes will hold you. When you're done with that, set your trailer brakes, release your tractor brakes, put the truck in drive, pull on it to make sure your trailer brakes will hold you into place. If your trailer happens to have drum brakes, it'll have slack adjusters. For these kind of brakes, you want to check the drum to make sure your drum is not cracked or broken. You want to check your brake shoes. You want to make sure that your brake shoes have at least 1/4 inch of brake shoe on them. You want to check your slack adjuster, which is this right here. Check your push rod, check your pins, and you want to check the cotter pin to make sure it is there. To adjust your slack adjuster, you want to hold your brake in for 3 to 5 seconds, and you want to hear it click. And you will do that 3 to 5 times until the clicking stops. At that point, your brakes should be set. The final part of the brake test is to release both your tractor and your trailer brakes. Place your tractor in drive, put your foot over the brake, and pull ahead at 5 miles an hour. If your truck pulls from left or right, you may have a brake issue. Before you leave, you also want to put your seatbelt on. Check to make sure your seatbelt is not torn or frayed, that it is properly secured in 3 spots. Also, make sure it latches properly. With that, if you have any questions, please contact our safety department. They'd be more than happy to help you.